prohibits traveling the plain for days, set adrift by conflict on an ocean of pale dust. The bullet wound in his left shoulder still ached despite the blood running down his arm, being long since dry. The sun, which had been the one ubiquitous constant since his gang had massacred in a firefight with the Apaches, was perched mockingly on the distant horizon, painting the western sky with hues of burning red. The intense heat felt almost palpable, as though you could reach out and set it with calloused fingertips. He pictured his mama's baking pot from when he was just a kid, and imagined this was very much like being trapped inside. His mind suddenly flooded with fond thoughts of home, fond thoughts of simply being here. He'd have shot his mama 10 times to escape this hell without a moment's hesitation. Leicester, his horse, was beginning to falter. It was the only creature on this desolate plain more wretched than him. 5 days of galloping without food or water had taken its toll on the animal, now little more than a pelt nailed to a set of creaking bones. The saddle felt too big for the horse's emaciated back, and with every stride, the sickly prod of Leicester's ribcage into his ankles, masked by a thin layer of furry skin. The quality of tissue paper, the sea abyss, so mighty and proud, reduced into such a pitiful state, was a sobering reminder of his own mortality, his own foolish, arrogant mistake. He turned his head to all sides and realized that this godforsaken desert was devoid even of plant life. Nary a cactus, nor a blade of parched grass emerging from a crack in the ground could be seen for 100 miles in any direction. When he coughed dust, and something in his chest rattled, like his body wanted to give up on him. The Marston gang, now deceased, were the most vicious band of outlaws this side of the Mexican border, with the string of murders, rapes, robberies that they wore like a pearl necklace with a reverence, only basked in their cruelty, ransacking villages, both European and native, and slaughtering to their heart's content until the streets were awash with blood, and smoke from burning buildings blotted out the sun's judgmental gaze. Laman had taken the cull in them, the gray ruin, as towns sit ye fell full into their clutches, were little more than burnt husks and ash upon their departure. And Cormac thought, though the word never passed, as crack lips, some of this is now, me being judged. He crossed the scorched landscape, covered in long dark cracks, like a network of veins on the skin of a dead god, and bore forward towards the horizon, as though it held some promise of redemption. The blast of gritty wind had coated both thin rider and the thin steed, and the layer of pale dust like a ghostly warrior, a pale horseman galloping the pages of Revelations to this genuine end-times wasteland. The desert seemed almost like a world unto itself, brought into existence to punish Cormac for his misdeeds. Whenever they rode at whatever speed, Cormac got the impression that death rode just behind them, invisible, unstoppable, inevitable. Not word was perhaps the scariest in the world, inevitable. Death was inevitable. Escape was merely conditional. This temperature often lent itself to mirages, where trembling heat in the distance gave the desert terrain the reflective qualities of blown glass. Sometimes it played tricks with your head. Maybe you catch glimmers of things that weren't there, like a lush green oasis on the horizon, beckoning you like the call of a siren. In that regard, the sight that assailed Cormac's wary eyes was no mirage. It looked like claws of some great and ancient monster protruding from the ground to form a perfect circle, where spires made from bleached white animal bones rose from their subterranean palms. You'd never seen quite so many bones of so many varieties of animals arranged to form what looked almost like a tiny settlement. Cormacs made tripods for erect spines that led to clustered skull peaks, and rib cages formed the bases for spider-like bone erasments, with a plethora of arms and legs jutting at unnatural angles. It was an oasis of bones filled with nightmarish ivory totems, and in the very heart of the skull, set the skull of an African elephant, on top of which perched a figure, sitting cross-legged with his head bowed, dressed completely in white. Cormac was shaken from his tired equanimity by the sight of the bone oasis. There were no other settlements for miles, and unless the bones of the white-clothed stranger's horse lay among the copious others, there was no telling how he got there, let alone how he managed to transport all of the carcasses. He spurred his horse and rode forward, watching the bone oasis grow larger on the horizon. The great claws that encircled the mandala were in fact the ribs of a whale, curving inward so that their points all aimed towards the elephant's skull in the center. As he and Leicester grew closer, Cormac began to comprehend the sheer size of the stranger. A great man garbed in a long white suit. 4 inches across the shoulders, at the very least, were the white, wide-brimmed tat that obscured his features entirely. The rider drew his Colt double-action revolver from the leather holster at his hip and pulled back the hammer with his thumb. He felt justified in exercising caution around a giant living amongst bones. And curled his index finger around the trigger, ready to fill him with burning lead at a moment's notice. When he and Leicester were separated from the skull throne by mere feet, he finally spoke out. "Now what in the hell is all this shit, mister?" he called out, cupping his left hand to the side of his mouth. "And what the hell are you doing up there?" It was a pause when all was silent, save for the wind, warbling as it passed through the bones. Leicester whined nervously, but Cormac ran his bony fingers through the animal's sparse black mane to silence him. "I'm waiting." So the stranger taut the elephant's skull, his cadence deep and measured as though he were standing right next to you. "Waiting," Cormac said to himself. His voice had dry croak rattling around the dusty walls of his throat. "Well, what in the hell are you doing waiting in a place like this?" The stranger gave a low, earthly chuckle, anticipating cement or taming, Mr. Marston, like all gentlemen of taste. Cormac gasped and clenched his fist around the handle of the pistol, raising it to shoulder height in shock. "Now how the hell you know my name? Everyone knows your name, Mr. Marston. Are you not the best marksman in Arizona? What does that apply to more of the myth than the actual man that inspired it?" You gave a frustrated grunt and droid on the stranger's head, still obscured by the hat. Cormac Marston had fired many shots in his day, and 9 out of 10 of these shots always found their way to someone's forehead, particularly when that someone wasn't showing him the proper respect. And what you heard was true. No man can gun a bastard down like me. But what of it, stranger? I can't shoot my way out of having a dry throat and empty belly as much as I can't shoot my way home from this hellhole. This gun might as well be a goddamn paperweight. The stranger I clearly heard what he wanted to hear and lifted his head to face Marston. Under the brim of his hat, Marston could see a pair of black eyes. Eyes that seemed to be hewn from coal, staring at him from a gray face. The man was aged, but not wrinkled, and had a completely leonine dignity about him. His lips were drawn in a thin, malevolent smile. The stranger seemed pleased. "Ah, but Marston, my boy, what if I told you that you could?" Cormac lowered his gun. Stranger's cryptic words appealed more to his desperation than his curiosity. His resolve weakened by hunger, dehydration, and exhaustion. In his glory days, Marston would have shot this joker, stole his fancy white hat and jacket, and left his corpse amongst all the others. Now, however, no such thought even occurred to him. "Keep talking?" Cormac said, his voice quiet and strained. With the agility that Cormac thought impossible for a man of his size, the stranger dismounted and landed deftly on his feet. It was wearing a pair of expensive-looking spats. Not your usual desert fare, Cormac thought. Then stood at his full height. The man was truly monstrous. Like one of those old Greek legends Cormac had read as a boy. A titan in the flesh. He was perhaps 8 feet tall at the very least, with arms and legs like the shafts of trees. Yet he was clothed like a dandy, with suit jacket, waistcoat, shirt, and pleated trousers that seemed fresh from the laundromat. The stranger was another preposterous enigma of the endless desert. "You betting man, Cormac?" Stranger said, sliding a gloved hand into his jacket and retrieving a standard deck of cards. "Most of you lot tend to be in my experience. Poker, blackjack, pontoon, all sorts of little games onto which wager chips and money and cigarettes. Well, it's great fun, don't you think, Cormac?" While talking, the stranger drew 4 cards from the deck, 2 black 80s and 2 black aces, which he casually threw into the ground between himself and Cormac. "Well, myself, I find the concept of the wager to be quite exciting." Stranger continued while shuffling the deck in one hand and gesticulating artfully with the other, as though he were conducting an orchestra. "However, it goes without saying that the excitement is truly proportional to that which is at stake. A game of poker played for mere money is a fool's errand, but a game of poker played for one's life. As true, gravitas. There is no room for levity in wagers, Mr. Marston. During this long-winded speech, Cormac felt as though the stranger was talking at him rather than to him. With the speech that he no doubt rehearsed to his audience of skeletons while awaiting the arrival of a hapless traveler. That being said, the important elements transcended the wordiness of the stranger's delivery. "You want to play cards with me?" Cormac gasped in a state of wide-eyed exasperation. Stranger scoffed. "Huh. Goodness no. I see no fun in cards. They were merely to illustrate my point. The game I wish to play with you involves your skills with that Teresa's shoot or my boy. Will put to the test whether you're really the greatest gunman in the whole state." Cormac nodded. His energy depleted. Forming words when unnecessary seemed pointless. The stranger saw this, and though his face didn't betray it, he felt a pang of irritation at Cormac's lack of enthusiasm for his little game. Meanwhile, the Chester remained silent and static. Cormac had tied his reins to one of the stranger's bone spires. "But first, my dear Marston, I have but one request of you," the stranger said, the saccharine tone of guise for bitterness. "I wish to know why the self-professed greatest marksman in the state of Arizona and leader of the Grey Ruin has fallen upon such hard times. You're wounded, exhausted, starving, and alone. How did this come to be? Well, I thought fortune smiled on you and your roving gang of criminals." Marston gave an indignant grunt. "For two reasons. The first was the spitefulness behind the stranger's words that he made no real effort to hide. The second was the fact that he got the distinct impression that the stranger already knew the answer to his questions." "Oh, I'll tell you," Cormac said. His brow arched in a tired fury. "Story and longing innate pretty neither, but I'll tell you. After I hear your name, that is. I don't do dealings with no man who I don't know the name of." Stranger grinned. "Smart boy." Smile seemed to whisper. "Herman Furlong, Marston. Then I've doubt you've heard of me. As opposed you could say I'm a traveler from an antique land, not unlike your own," said Herman Furlong, removing his wide-brimmed hat to reveal a slick backhead of silver hair. "Now, if you please, the story." Cormac bowed his head, and what almost seemed like a bizarre parody of benediction, closed his eyes and exhaled the dusty breath. "All right, Herman Furlong, I'll tell you," Cormac replied, as a voice seemingly slow and considerate. "Well, we was out in Texas when it happened. Came across a few tens full of sleeping engines. We figured it'd be fun to shoot a lot of them. They were just squalls and kids anyway, wouldn't put up much of a fight." Furlong's eyes seemed to light up at the prospect of violence, conflict, and bloodshed. His thin smile began to cut further into his cheeks as the story unfolded. "I put him up to it, after all. And then dumb son of bitches did whatever I said, because they knew I'd take their goddamn heads off if they said any different," Cormac said, seeming almost nostalgic for his fallen brothers, though his voice was tinged with inflections of sadness. "So me and the boys killed the whole lot of them, left none alive, and we rode off having a high old time." "Indeed, Mr. Marston, indeed. And what happened after that?" "Well, we rode on the next day, not thinking of it, and especially not expecting any retribution over it. But around midday, and this is what, maybe a week ago, a whole bunch of screaming whale and the Apaches came down on us with the wrath of gods in their heart. Jesus, it was 30 against 300. We never stood a goddamn chance. They shot the hell out of the boys, killed every last one of them, and one of them cheeky son of bitches put a bullet in my shoulder while it was hightailing it out of there." While telling this part of the tale, Cormac pointed towards the wound in his shoulder for emphasis. Furlong merely smiled, then nodded. "Since then, I've been riding day and night. No food, no water, no nothing. And now I'm here talking to some big fucking freak of nature in a desert boneyard. Is that extensive enough for you, Furlong?" The soft-spoken giant that was Herman Furlong gave a polite golf clap and a single peptic chuckle that seemed to jangle insultingly in Marston's ear canals. This was his response to Cormac's tale of tragedy, the tale a massacre of Apache women and children in every last one of Marston's gang. It was like little more than some roadside puppet show to him. "I have 3 wagers for you, Cormac. Not one less, not one more. I will present them to you one by one with the accompanying stakes. I shall offer you, well, I stand to lose in each instance, as well as stating my demands of what you should do when I win the given wager. Is that clear, Mr. Marston? Crystal. Good, my boy. Very good indeed. We're gonna have a grand old time. Cormac felt a chill like cold sweat trickle down his back. The kind only a fella like Herm and Furlong, and all of his bizarre, monstrous glory could instill in a man. He had no reason to trust the strange giant who sat amongst bones and laughed at stories of violence and misery. But the alternative was certain death in a seemingly endless desert. This was, at worst, at least a distraction from the inevitability of it all. Without speaking, Furlong pointed to one of his bone spires about 40 feet away, one made from the skull of an antelope sitting atop the straightened spine of a crocodile, propped up at the collective elbow of 4 skeletal horse legs. My first wager, Mr. Marston, is an easy one. You have 1 shot, and with that shot you must topple the skull of the antelope from that bone totem in the distance there. Marston squinted until it became more defined in his vision. He could see cavernous eye sockets and 2 slender horns protruding from the skull, and for a moment considered why he shouldn't simply turn the gun on Furlong instead. He realized that perhaps Furlong's true value wasn't something that could be looted from his corpse, perhaps. As a man who looked composed and well-groomed in the center of a desert, he knew a quick way out of this hell. I accept your wager, Cormac said, his voice unwavering. Well, you haven't heard terms yet, my boy, Furlong said, reaching into a suit jacket and producing a metal canteen. Should I win, your boots become mine. If you win, my canteen and the water inside it becomes yours. Do you accept my wager? Cormac thought at length about the water in Furlong's canteen. When it was on the table, he finally became aware of the sheer depth of his own thirst. His throat felt like it was crumbling into dust. His stomach ached. His kidneys throbbed. He hadn't taken a decent piss in days. He nodded frantically, more motivated to win than ever. With Furlong's smile of approval, Cormac leveled the revolver and lined the antelope skull up between his iron sights. He felt as though he was preparing to assassinate the devil from here. The horns were visible just above the sights. He exhaled, squeezed the trigger, and a Berlian blast of sound tore through the silence of the desert. In a split second, the antelope's skull exploded into shards of enamel, a deep cavity tearing through the forehead, and it fell in 2 pieces from the tip of Furlong's totem. Well done, my boy, very well done indeed, he said, tossing the small sloshing canteen into Cormac's eager palms. Well, there's your prize, you certainly earned it. Houston was ferocious, barely even unscrewing the lid before he tore into the canteen and began drinking from it. To his surprise, matter how much he drank, water seemed to keep flowing, as though Furlong's canteen was truly bottomless. No, Cormac took no time to question the logic of things. He drank like it was his first time in his life. My second wager, Mr. Marston, is somewhat higher stakes, Furlong said, with pronounced glee, running his gloved hand through his silver man. Should I win, my prize is your gun. However, if you win, I'll part with the directions back to civilization. Cormac's eyes lit up. Seems too good to be true, he thought to himself. Through his mind, now flooded with thoughts of escape, quickly washed away any inklings of doubt. What rings will Furlong expect me to jump through in order to achieve that? I accept your wager. Your challenge is to shoot the 4 playing cards I placed at your feet, Cormac. I expect to see a bullet hole through every one of them if you wish to win this game. Mr. Mann would have assumed that Furlong wanted him to fire into the 4 cards while they were laid out right in front of him. But Cormac, for all his faults, was far too crafty for that. In the next instant, Furlong's great foot came sweeping down and swept up the cards in a cloud, a pale dust casting them into the air. Without a moment to spare, Cormac raised the barrel of his pistol and fired off 4 shots at the speed of a typewriter clicking away, and as if by magic, every card, 2 black 8s and 2 black aces, fluttered to the ground with perfect holes in their centers. Even Furlong seemed impressed. Now give me the directions of this goddamn shit heap, Furlong. Don't worry, my boy, I'm a man of my word. There's a settlement 200 miles east of here, where you can eat and sleep on a horse. You could probably make the journey in approximately 2 days. Perhaps 3 with your horse. It's likely you'll stay alive until that point with the help of my canteen. And with that, Cormac was satiated. He had no further desire to gamble when he finally had the knowledge and the means to escape the desert alive. He began silently untying Leicester from a skeletal steed. "But what of the third wager, Mr. Marston? I'm not interested. I've played enough of these games. Will you at least hear me out?" "No need. Sorry if I wasted your time." Furlong's black eyes burned in frustration. His firm cadence had grown to be imploring, but he would not be denied. "Mr. Marston, though you may have your small-minded head jammed elsewhere, it has escaped your attention that once you've eaten and slept, you will wake to indignance. You are penniless. Your friends and companions are dead and scout, and though you may have escaped the desert, you will die amidst urban squalor in your poverty." Format paused and looked back at him, his face hard and unkind, but moved by Furlong's depressingly accurate assertions into giving the cruel man his undivided attention for the very last time. "I, however, can remedy this situation for you, Mr. Marston. As you may be able to tell, a man means a man of great affluence, but you win my next wager. I will assure you that you will be far richer than you could ever even imagine. You could buy and sell all your old compatriots 1,000 times over, and still be the wealthiest man in the state." Now Marston would be lying if he said that didn't tempt him. It was a drive for wealth that made him form that accursed head gang in the first place, and they were government-sanctioned scalp hunters rather than brutish criminals. If he obtained the wealth that Furlong pitched, he'd never have to work another day in his life. He could live in comfort until the day he died. "And what do you get if you win?" Cormac asks with a voice almost timid, seduced by Furlong's riches. "Or a horse," replied Furlong, his gray arm extended, and a thick finger pointed towards Leicester. "And what's the challenge?" Cormac asked, weighing up all the pros and cons, the risks and rewards. "Look high above you, Marston, to the red sky painted by the setting sun." He craned his head upwards and saw a single vulture, around and around in a single arc, as though it was manipulated by gravity rather than its own volition. "There's your target, Cormac. If you could shoot that vulture, then you could return to civilization wealthier than you ever imagined. And if you lose, well, then your horse becomes my property." There was a moment of complete silence. "Accept your wager." Furlong grinned. If he could shoot the cards, then the bird would surely be no problem. Cormac leveled his pistol until the vulture flapped its wings between the iron sights of the Colt double-action revolver. He excelled. A shot was fired, and the bird squawked in pain as a bullet pierced its torso, and it pitched down to the earth below, perishing upon impact. Furlong felt the breath leave his body. His skin tightened, and what little water was in his system began to escape a sweat. His pupils dilated. His muscles tensed painfully. He hadn't fired a shot. Cormac turned his head to face Furlong, who was carrying a Smith & Wesson Model T revolver in one of his great clubbed hams, with wisps of smoke climbing from the barrel. "The deal's a deal, Mr. Marston," Furlong said with a sickening chuckle as he leveled his own pistol and fired a round into Leicester's head, splattering ruby-colored arterial blood into the bleach bones behind him as the dead horse collapsed into the dust. Marston's mouth was agape. A bastard cheated. That bastard cheated, and he just shot my only way out of this nightmare. You lying son of a bitch. Cormac screamed at the top of his lungs and raised his pistol, the fire's final shot, into Furlong's grinning mug. 2 shots rang out, neither of them Cormac's. The first shot crashed into his Colt double-action, destroying the cylinder and tearing it from his hands. The second shot torn to Cormac's knuckles, sending 2 fingers flying into the dirt, while blood spurted from the stumps on his injured hand. "I never told you a single lie, Mr. Marston. I don't appreciate this, Lander," Furlong said with a twisted grin, while Marston held his injured hand in agony, blood pouring in gouts from between his fingers. "Everything I have done has been in accordance with our arrangement." Cormac looked at his mangled hand, then back at Furlong with true hatred and his eyes. "You bastard! You sick bastard! I'll kill you." Before Cormac could take a single step, Furlong pointed his revolver downwards and fired the 2 remaining shots. One found their way to each of Cormac's kneecaps, shattering them, and sending him down with a thump to the dusty ground, writhing and crippling pain. His hand, blood as both his knees, while the excruciating burning sensation that comes part and parcel with getting shot worked its magic. Now any subsequent punishment has merely been self-defense, Mr. Marston. Cormac squirmed, but beyond that, he couldn't move. The pain was beyond thought, a transcended imagination. His hand was destroyed. His gun was destroyed. His legs were both useless. His horse, dead. The injuries weren't fatal, but Furlong had killed him. With every bullet he'd hammered another nail into his coffin. "If it's any consolation, Cormac," Furlong said while stepping closer, "you did still win 2 out of 3 wagers. It's an impressive testament to your skills as a marksman. It, however, you lacked, and if one should pay for anything, then it should be a shortcoming of skill. Don't you agree?" Cormac simply breathed the words, "Fuck you," and continued to squirm. Furlong, in response, pressed his foot quite slowly down on the Cormac's shattered kneecaps, and gave a smile when the screams tore through the tranquility of the cold desert night. "Why did you do this?" Cormac moaned. "Shoot you?" "No, all of it. Why did you make this place? Why did you give me the wagers? Hell, why the canteen? Why the directions? Why the bird? Why any of it?" Cormac had broken down and begun to sob, violently in pain and resignation. "Oh, well, that's quite simple," Furlong said, dropping to one knee and looking at Cormac. "Eye to eye. Because you lost hope. You were ready to die. You'd accepted it. No man should die without hope, Cormac. Don't you agree?" In stunned silence, Cormac simply looked back at Furlong as the wind carried those last 3 words. "Don't you agree?" in an echo that seemed almost eternal. Furlong grinned, his body and face crumbling into dust and sand, pouring out amongst the bones and blowing away in the wind. The canteen dissolved into nothingness, as did the elephant's skull and every other bone, as though they'd aged 1,000 years in mere seconds. Even the body of Leicester crumbled into dust and ash, until all that was left was Cormac, surrounded by a kingdom of dust. He screamed one more time, though this time there wasn't a soul to hear it. For all he knew, he was the last man on earth, screaming into darkness, into emptiness. Then when his voice grew hoarse and the water turned to dust in his throat, he grew silent again, alone with his thoughts. No more Furlong, no more Leicester, no more wagers, no more Oasis of Bones. Just him and the pain and his memories to keep him company. Cormac Marston lay dying in the endless desert, and he'd never felt so alone.